Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books. Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore, and I am super excited to be here tonight with Grady Hendrix to celebrate the final girl support group. I have loved every single book that Grady has written. No joke, one of my favorite authors, always an event when Grady puts a new book out, and thankfully he puts a new book out with quite a solid regular schedule, so we're very lucky. This one, of course, lived up to the hype. Lots of folks have already got it in their hands. Many of you pre-ordered the book and got the special extras, which are so fun. One of the things that we love about you, Grady, is that because you are such a fan, you know the best fan service stuff, and make cool stuff. So one of the things that we wanted to do was just, we've really been wanting to get to celebrate. We wanted to celebrate your last book with you physically at Charis, and then COVID hit. We wanted to celebrate this book with you physically, but we were just talking before this event. Not safe yet for us to do that. So we're really excited that we get to host you virtually and get to do this version of your one-man show in celebration. And maybe one for the next book or the one after that, we'll get to have an in-person party and do it up. But we're thrilled to have you here. We're grateful to everyone watching at home. Kick back, relax, get a beverage and some snacks, and we're gonna dive right in celebration of the final girl support group.
Hey y'all, I'm Grady Hendrix. I'm the author of the Final Girl Support Group, and I don't know you. I'm not even in the same room with you. I don't know how tall you are, what you drink first thing in the morning, if you're a cat person or a dog person, what inspirational quote you have tattooed on your forearm, but I know one thing about you. Old, young, American, Canadian, Black, white, Asian, Latinx, or prefer not to answer, you don't want to get murdered. Ever since the invention of the printing press, we have been writing and selling books, and a disproportionate number of them have been about murder. Ever since the movie camera was invented, we have been making a large number of movies about murder. You would think this means we love murder, that we enroll our kids in after-school murder programs or go on vacation to murder parks, maybe spend our Friday nights making plans to get into that hot new murder restaurant. Believe it or not, it's the opposite. Human beings spend a surprisingly large amount of their lives trying not to get murdered. And you're saying to yourself, hey, Grady, you're right. I don't want to get murdered. But how? Ever since I got Facebook, I've been worried about being murdered by pretty much everything on earth. I'm here to help. Ever since I was a small ginger child, I've been watching movies and reading books about murder. And tonight, I'm going to give you some tips on how not to get murdered. First off, don't make friends. Friends get you to do things like sneak into a mall after hours where you'll be murdered by security robots, or sneak into a carnival after hours where you'll be murdered by the owner's deformed monster son, or go camping where you'll be murdered by pretty much everything in the woods. Friends will invite you for trips on their yacht, or to visit a timeshare on the ski slopes, or to come out to a costume party. Sounds fun? You'll die. Friends like to play pranks, which inevitably go wrong. Maybe they put a corpse in your bed and trick you into making out with it. Maybe they mischievously push you out a second-story window to your death. Maybe they lure you into a bathroom with the promise of sex, give you a lace joint, and then douse you with acid. It's all a good laugh right now, but you're going to have to return later to murder every single one of them. Where friends are concerned, get a cat. Or not. Next, the next step in not getting murdered, drop out of school. By 6th grade, you can read and write, do long division, and play the recorder. What else do you need? If you're smart, drop out then and there, because if you want to do trig, study AP history, or learn about the symbolism in The Great Gatsby, you will wind up dead. Because whether it's a straightforward public high school like Central High or Crawford Academy, Montreal's elite academic institution, if you go to high school, you will die. Boarding school is not a loophole. If you manage to survive high school and go to college, I don't mean to sound critical, but you deserve what you get. But if you have a child who insists on going to college, and I get it, children, they're just yap, 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 want, and sometimes you just give them things to shut them up. So if your child wants to go to college and you want to get them out of the house and don't want them living in your basement, take a pen, okay? These are colleges to avoid. Lanier College, Pritchard College, Wendell College, it had to be university, DeWitt University, St. Trinian's College, Windsor College. I've heard that some students who survived Pendleton University thought it was a good idea and they might have a better experience transferring to Alpine University. No. And if you think this doesn't apply to you because you're participating in Greek life where you'll have a support network and safety in numbers, well, please, I laugh at your naivete. Don't even get me started on medical school. Third, and this is the most important thing in terms of not getting murdered, don't go anywhere. In fact, don't do anything. Don't go on vacation. If you go on vacation, don't go to Texas. Don't go to the supermarket. Don't go to the hospital. Don't park your car. Don't babysit. Don't play sports. Don't support sports. Don't go to the gym. Don't play paintball. That's a sport. Don't go to prom. Don't go to camp. Just stay home or not. And one big thing, I know it's a lot of information coming at you super fast. And so you're like, whoa, my head's spinning. I get it. So, one simple thing, something you can do to start, don't answer the phone. Phones are very, very bad. Sometimes you answer the phone, it's someone telling you the insurance on a car you don't even own is about to expire. Sometimes you answer the phone, it's someone telling you they're going to kill you. Sometimes you answer the phone, it's your mom wanting to tell you about an article she read on Facebook. Sometimes you answer the phone, it's a high-pitched digital noise that makes your brain melt. If you're a chandelier salesman named Chad who recently shaved your beard, when you answer the phone, it's more likely than not to be a serial killer. Now, Chad lives in Houston. He's constructed a successful career selling what the author of Night Calls describes as things that could be constructed around one or more light bulbs. Humans like us know those as lights. One night, Chad receives a phone call on a device that is constructed around the receiving of one or more phone calls. It's a serial killer who's torturing a woman to death. He makes Chad listen. This is so upsetting to Chad that when he calls the police and they send over Detective Sharon Reason, Chad immediately begins flirting with her because nothing gets you in the mood to seduce one woman than listening to another woman get tortured for hours before being shotgunned in the face. Night after night, the night caller becomes more annoying and more deadly, like a terrible telemarketer. Finally, Chad lets him go to the machine. When that turns out to be a terrible idea, because once the killer realizes that Chad sent him the answering machine, he shotgun murders 5 people in quick succession to reinforce Chad the notion that when he calls, Chad should not screen those calls. But it turns out that the killer isn't actually murdering people. I mean, he is murdering people, literally. When the police psychiatrist shows up, he helpfully explains that the killer's shotgun is actually a penis. And when he pulls the trigger, he's actually ejaculating. When people's brains splatter all over their wallpaper, he's actually impregnating them. But also, the psychiatrist in the boat goes out to the bar with Chad Detective Reason, then leaves them alone so they can enhance their personal relationship. Hopefully not with the shotgun. Although you can see how in a dark room you might get that mixed up with your penis. Although, as the police psychiatrist helpfully explains, there's no such thing as a dark room. There are only wombs. Now, the police set many clever traps to catch this killer, including putting deep discounts on some swanky chandeliers in the hope that the killer can't resist a bargain. Chad, on the other hand, decides to use the radical strategy of actually listening to what the killer has to say when he calls, which, as any woman who's ever gone on a date with a man knows, is rare. Chad listens so hard that he uncovers the killer's primal hamster trauma that turned him into a serial killer. When the killer shows up at his latest victim's stylish condo, Chad gets there moments after him because he has tracked him down by tracking down these traumatic hamsters. The police surround the condo with their guns drawn, trying to lure Chad into luring the killer outside so the sniper can lure a bullet through his brain with his penis. Or does it impregnate his brain with a shotgun? I get him mixed up. Chad is shocked and affronted by all this violence and instead uses his unnatural listening abilities to talk the killer into surrendering, promising him that he'll never be alone again and he'll get him all the help he needs now to tell a shotgun from a penis again. And the killer listens, and Chad listens, and everything de-escalates in a very healthy, sane, and non-dramatic way as the killer bursts into tears, and Chad holds him while the killer cries, "I'm so scared." "You don't need to be," Chad says. "I'm here now." Then he opens the door and begs the police not to frighten his new friend who just murdered 11 people. So, in short, the next time you want to answer the phone, send a letter. Or not. Primal hamster trauma, or PHT, is only one reason people grow up to become serial killers. Sometimes people become serial killers because a little girl they liked in first grade crumpled up the Valentine card they gave her and threw it on the floor. Sometimes they become serial killers because they saw their mothers murder their fathers. Sometimes they become serial killers because their mother yelled at them for putting together the wrong jigsaw puzzle as a child. Sometimes they get lost in the woods after their mother died and they turn into homicidal cavemen all by themselves. But the one thing I think you're seeing a common thread here, every single one of these serial killers became a serial killer because of something that happened to them when they were a child or something that a child did to them. Children in slasher movies are absolutely horrible. They taunt orphans, they crumple up Valentines, they set cabins on fire with handyman inside, and the handyman has to come back 10 years later and murder everyone in camp. So you can understand that murdering children is a very, very popular pastime with serial killers, as in Rockabye Baby. with this beautiful, beautiful Lisa Falkenstern cover. Welcome to Goldsmith, Alabama. Maris McCready, seen here, is not just a serial killer pedophile, but he also pretends to be handicapped so he can use a special taxi service and get a 20% discount at the Shoney's Breakfast Bar. As Dr. Loomis said in Halloween, look into the eyes of pure evil. Dressing as a nurse in an outfit he inherited from his sister, Maris prowls the Alabama woods, spying on little girls, asking to examine their swollen glands, and then strangling them. He calls himself the Blue Fur Lady, but later he'll call himself Sister and also the Beautiful Phantom, and everyone's like, make up your mind. And then for a while he calls himself Tootsie after his favorite movie. Now, it's PTA night, and Sister or Tootsie or the Blue Fur Lady knows that 15-year-old Todd will be babysitting his little sister while their parents are at the PTA meeting, and Todd's idea of babysitting is to put Jessica before the television set and tell her to stay there while he retreated to his room and blasted his psyche with Bruce Springsteen rock and roll music. So after murdering Jessica in front of the TV, Maris retreats to her lair, full of Garfield memorabilia, and reads his precious comic books because rock music plus comic books equal dead children. Who will stop this crazed comic book reader? Prince Gannon, of course, a third grader with a rare blood condition that means all he gets for an after-school snack is one raw carrot. Prince's daddy is secretly dying of cancer, which we know because he recites the poetry of John Donne at the dinner table and says things like, well, son, I believe in the magic of the human spirit. And as we all know, the only people who say that in books and movies are people who are going to be dead soon. Prince has a magic girlfriend in the woods named Nandina, who has a hunchback, withered arm, and wears a burlap dress. She lived with her Aunt Evie and is worried about something bad coming that she can feel in the atmosphere, and also she's a ghost who can do magic. Meanwhile, Clay Lawrence, a tough cop from Atlanta, Georgia, is sent to stop the killer who seems to be on a lunar cycle. Now, I don't know why they sent a tough cop from Atlanta to Alabama, but the lunar cycle thing, I know where that comes from because they've never mentioned it in Rockabye Baby before, but suddenly the killer's on a lunar cycle, probably because Stephen Gresham read Red Dragon, Thomas Harris's 1981 very influential serial killer book, in which the killer is on a lunar cycle. Now, you're asking, Grady, how are you making this jump that Stephen Gresham read Red Dragon? Because Stephen Gresham lifts entire scenes from Red Dragon and puts them into Rockabye Baby, only the stupid version. Clay Lawrence, the tough cop from Atlanta, spends most of the book worried about what will happen to his comic book collection if he gets murdered by the Blue Fur Lady. So now we know what's going through Jodie Foster's mind when she's in that serial killer's basement at the end of Silence of the Lambs. Clay's manner of investigation is to just wander around Alabama aimlessly until he arrests Alberto D'Angelo, a pedophile of the non-murdery variety who's been living inside the ducts of the First Methodist Church. And it's a false arrest, but I'm okay with that. The fewer pedophiles we have living inside the HVAC systems of our Methodist churches, the better. What else does Clay Lawrence do besides keeping the HVAC systems of Methodist churches pedo-free? Not much. Nandina, on the other hand, says, I'm telling you, boy, I'm more in a little skirt of this here killer. So Prince demands that Nandina teach him shadow magic, which is too stupid for me to describe, but basically he shrinks into a sparkling ball of shadows and flies around town. Things come to a climax at the birthday party of Prince's other one-armed girlfriend. And I want to point out, it's a birthday party which was advertised on the local radio station, which seems a touch unwise to advertise a third grader's birthday party when there's a serial killing pedophile at large, but maybe her parents really hate her and wanted to put her out on a plate with a sign next to it that said free samples. At the birthday party, Blue Fur Maris, Tootsie, Sister, whatever you're calling them, tries to abduct the little one-armed birthday girl, but Prince uses his shadow magic to make the Blue Fur Lady run away. However, he can't identify the killer, and the police say, son, can you remember one detail to help us catch this terrible person? Prince says, I cannot remember anything about this guy. If only I could remember one thing about the way he looked. And then 2 weeks later, Prince remembers that the killer was dressed as Garfield, the cat. Knowing they're on the lookout for someone with a larger than average collection of Garfield memorabilia, Nandina and Prince track down Blue Fur, who is snuck into an elementary school classroom using his Star Wars lightsaber flashlight, written, "Nobody gets out of here alive" on the chalkboard, urinated all over the list of classroom rules, stolen a scarf, tied it on his head, ripped it off, thrown it on the teacher's desk with a note that reads, "Dear Madam Bitch, I'm planning to strangle you with this scarf. Signed, the monster." Then he rubs a Raggedy Ann doll all over his body until he realizes that a child beat him at the birthday party because he's trying to become a woman. And he needs to break the chains of gender and become the beautiful phantom who is neither male nor sexless, male nor female, a sexless, beautiful, powerful phantom. Nandina and Prince use their shadow powers to track down Maris, and Nandina hypnotizes her with her spooky ghost light, while Prince smacks him on both cheeks with hands dipped in hawk's blood. And I don't know where he got the hawk's blood, but then he runs away and tells Clay, the cop, to come, and Clay finds blue fur covered with hawk's blood in a room with photos of the dead children on the wall with X's drawn over their faces. And whether he's blue fur lady, the monster, Maris' sister, Tootsie, or his own sister, or the beautiful Phantom, it turns out that the one thing all of Maris' identities have in common is a serious bullet allergy. But Clay the cop is haunted by killing another human being. And so he gives Prince his comic book collection and leaves town. I think that's a suicide metaphor. Prince uses his shadow magic to cure his daddy's cancer, but ironically, the strain accelerates his own blood disease beyond the point where it can be treated by eating raw carrots. And since that seems to be the only option in the medical arsenal of Alabama, Prince dies. Like you, this book left me with many questions. The biggest one: why do murder books hate trans people? Sometimes a book changes everything, like The Exorcist or Jaws. And, in 1988, that book was Silence of the Lambs. Its game changer status got solidified a few years later when Jonathan Demme's film adaptation swept the 1991 Academy Awards, taking home Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actress, Best Actor, Best Adapted Screenplay, and making Anthony Hopkins Hannibal Lecter a pop culture icon. Now, there's no need. We all know this movie. I don't need to recap it, but in case there are any small infants who might just be watching and they were born recently, I will give a recap of Silence of the Lambs. So, Silence of the Lambs is about an FBI agent hunting a serial killer with the assistance of another serial killer. The helpful serial killer is played by Anthony Hopkins. The bad serial killer is played by Ted Levine. The helpful serial killer eats his victims and murders numerous police officers in the course of the film. The bad serial killer skins his victims and doesn't murder anyone during the movie. However, we can tell he's bad because he puts on makeup, wears women's clothing, and says he wants to become a lady. During its initial release, the filmmakers waved away criticism from LGBT groups by saying the bad serial killer wasn't gay or trans, he was just confused. And we all bought it, probably because we've been conditioned by years of serial killer books and movies that claimed the easiest way to spot the killer was to look for the dude wearing a dress. In Three on a Meat Hook, the killer cross-dresses, just like Leatherface does at one point in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Cross-dressing and trans killers appear in Deranged, Relentless 3, Fatal Games, Dressed to Kill. The entire climax of Sleepaway Camp was the crying game revelation that the killer is trans, which in 1983 blew teenage boys' minds everywhere. And murder books are just as bad as movies. It's not just the blue fur lady. In Richard LaPlante's Steroid Blues, we meet Jack Dunn, a bodybuilder who lives in a depressing house in Philadelphia where he takes a lot of steroids, prays a lot, gobbles Allium, but also meth, so it's confusing. His hobbies are pumping iron until his muscles hurt, and then getting on the phone and screaming in a high-pitched voice, help me, to random people he calls. He also has a beard, lots of body hair from all the steroids he's shooting, and a wiener that's always flopping out the side of his bodybuilding trunks like a, quote, brown, oversized earthworm, and it hangs down to his knees. Jack Dunn likes to dress up as his dead sister, Jacqueline Dunn. You see where this is going. And so it's no surprise when we learn that Jack Dunn's hobby, besides weightlifting, is punching people to death. But it turns out that his sister, Jacqueline Dunn, was a bodybuilder who used to go to Animals, a gym run by Horst Nichols, a neo-Nazi powerlifting steroid dealer whom we first meet cracking open a frozen monkey skull on the edge of his desk and sucking down the raw glandular fluid. Horst wears a black and red unitard made of spandex with an enormous pair of prosthetic silicone testicles built into the crotch. And he's German, so he says fun things like, what's happening? And get out of my fucking way. He seems to have also sex murdered Jacqueline. But then it turns out that Jack Dunn isn't Jacqueline Dunn's brother. And it turns out that Jacqueline Dunn wasn't a steroid-addicted gym bunny sex murdered by Horst Nichols. It turns out that Jacqueline Dunn was a cop sent undercover to bust Horst's steroid ring, but he got inside her head and turned her into a bodybuilding steroid-shooting gym bunny and killed her brother to get her to go off the case. Jack Dunn, we see in the book, is actually Jacqueline Dunn, who is so hooked on steroids that she's grown enormous muscles, a thick mat of body hair, a full beard, and that brown oversized earthworm that hangs down to her knees is her clitoris. Because, ladies, you know what happens if you go to the gym too much? You turn into a man. This anti-trans trope is way too pervasive to spring out of nowhere. Beware! Neither transsexuals nor transvestites make the FBI's profile of serial killers, so it has nothing to do with reality. You follow this toxic trail back far enough, and you think you've arrived at Psycho, Alfred Hitchcock's 1960s zeitgeist-changing hit about Norman Bates, a serial killer who dresses as his mother and has zany adventures while trying to find love and run a small motel. But behind Hitchcock's movie is Robert Bloch's book, Psycho. And the book and the movie are very close together. They're almost identical, except in the book, Norman Bates is an obese middle-aged man who's obsessed with his mother, whereas in the movie, he's handsome young Anthony Perkins who's obsessed with his mother. Robert Bloch got the idea for Psycho when he was 41 years old, with no money, no prospects, and a stalled writing career, trapped in a tiny Wisconsin town. Then Ed Gein happened. Another local Wisconsin boy, Gein was arrested in a nearby town for a murder in 1957, and when police searched his house, they found it stuffed with trophies and accessories made from the skin and bones of his victims and multiple bodies he'd exhumed from local cemeteries. Gein went down in history as a necrophiliac transvestite who wore women's skin and kept his mother's corpse in the basement. The problem? Gein wasn't a necrophile, he wasn't a transvestite, and he never exhumed his mother's body. He did wear women's skin, however. These ideas seem to have sprung from this 8-page Life magazine pictorial that threw in the line that Gein wished he were a woman. The only catch? A psychiatrist hadn't even examined him when this article was written. As the local crime lab director said, "That's news to me." Life seemed to have gotten the idea that Gein wanted to be a woman from the Milwaukee Journal, which wrote about Gein's unnatural attachment to his mother, quoting an unidentified investigator who was never identified because he probably didn't exist. They also got an armchair psychiatrist who'd never met Gein and in fact lived in Chicago, very far away, to claim that Gein wished he had been born a woman instead of a man and shows signs of acute transvestitism. The actual psychiatric profile of Gein, the one not written to sell newspapers, said nothing about cross-dressing or transvestitism, or his mother's corpse for that matter. All this cross-dressing talk seems to derive from a single polygraph transcript in which the operator Joe Wilimowski suggested to Gein several times that he enjoyed wearing women's clothes and body parts. That could be, Gein cheerfully admitted, and suddenly he was a transvestite who wanted to be a woman for the rest of eternity. This is probably a good place to note that Gein was also known to be highly suggestible and had a hard time telling the difference between what people told him had happened and what had actually happened. But so where did Wilimowski get this idea to insert cross-dressing into Gein's story? In the late 1950s, America was getting increasingly hysterical over crime. The juvenile delinquent was the most terrifying figure in pop culture, and the United States Senate had just held hearings about how comic books turn good boys bad. Within months of Gein's arrest, Charles Starkweather went on a shooting spree in the Midwest for reasons no one could understand, followed by the apparently motiveless Clutter family killings, which became In Cold Blood, and then came the 1960 arrest of Melvin Rees, another serial killer. Why were these white men suddenly killing people for no good reason? There was only one obvious answer: their mothers. A psychiatric theory making the rounds in the 40s and 50s claimed that mothers who showed too much affection for their sons turned them into criminals and sexual deviants. If your mother was close to you, there was a good chance you'd wind up a sissy. Philip Wiley's 1942 bestseller, Generation of Vipers, laid everything at Mom's feet. Mom's first gracious presence at the ballot box was roughly concomitant with the start towards an all-time low in political scurviness, hoodlumism, gangsterism, labor strife, monopolistic thuggery, moral degeneration, civic corruption, smuggling, bribery, theft, murder, homosexuality, drunkenness, financial suppression, chaos, and war. Jesus Christ, Mom, cut it out. Robert Moskin wrote an article in Look magazine in 1958 called The American Male, Why Do Women Dominate Him? Richard Green published his study, The Sissy Boy Syndrome, in 1987, based on research he began in 1953, trying to identify why some boys grew up to be gay or trans, and he laid it all at the feet of Mom. Unlike fathers, a mother's involvement with investment with sons must be only temperate. It must be finely tuned to provide the son with security and emotional warmth. There must be just enough of mother to round off the hard edges carved by father. She must not smother, stifle, or feminize. Incidentally, the psychological profile of the Boston Strangler developed by the police in the early 60s to help catch him said that he was probably homosexual, and his mother was a punitive, overwhelming woman. As late as 1980, the DSM claimed that mothers who hug their sons too much caused them to become trans. And so there you have it. A busted psychiatric theory about how mothers made their sons gay and trans got shoehorned into the case against Ed Gein by eager psychiatrists, and they made it into Robert Bloch's novel based on the Gein case, which wound up in Alfred Hitchcock's hit movie based on Bloch's book, which flowed out like a poisonous river, leaving its rancid traces on dozens, if not hundreds, of serial killer books and slasher movies. It's an idea that persists today, even among people who have enough tattoos to know better. When you Google Ed Gein, most articles describe him as a mama's boy, as seen on these t shirts now on sale online. A man ruined by his domineering mother. A narrative that totally leaves out the fact that, according to Gein himself, his father was an alcoholic nightmare who gruesomely physically abused Gein and his brother for years. Fun fact, the Boston Strangler also has an alcoholic, physically abusive father. But why pay attention to that? After all, we all know everything is always mom's fault. So, children and mothers, both to be completely avoided if you do not want to get killed or become a killer. If you have a child or a mother in your house, I highly recommend that when this show is over, you kill them. It's you or them. Who else besides children and moms becomes a killer? Well, there's mutant redneck cannibal families. Avoid them. Escapees from mental hospitals, avoid also. Overly competitive people, and this one doesn't get as much attention as it should. But whether you're an actor who really wants a role, a mascot who wishes she was a cheerleader instead, or an Olympic athlete who's on steroids and transitioned from male to female so to compete in the women's events and are now killing everyone who knows your secret, competitive people are terrible. But some people kill because they blame everyone else for their problems. Pamela Voorhees in Friday the 13th, Part 1, murders all the campers and counselors at Crystal Lake because she blames them completely irrationally for the drowning death of her son, Jason. Then her son grows up to murder campers and counselors for the murder of his mother in the previous movie. And I get it. The guy loved his mom. He's really hacked off. She got decapitated. Although I feel like by the time you get to Friday the 13th, Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, you're beginning to think Jason might have just lost his way a little. I understand. It's easy to blame other people for your problems, but I want to take a moment to tell you while we're having this time together that if you are rescuing someone who got injured while skiing and broke your leg in the process, thereby ending your Olympic dreams, it does not make any sense to wait years later to invite all that guy's friends over to a timeshare on the ski slopes where you murder them one by one with snowplows and icicles. If your family died in a fire started by an insane cult leader who locked the doors of the movie theater while showing his weird short film and burned everyone to death and disfigured you severely, it is not okay to track down his daughter years later and murder everybody who's attending her all-night horror movie marathon. People, you've got to take responsibility for your own actions. You are the captain of your own ship. It's on you, not other people. But there is one kind of killer who it's not their fault at all. One killer who is completely blameless for their actions. One killer who kills because he doesn't know any better. He kills because teenagers broke into his home. He kills because he doesn't know any other way. And I'm talking, of course, about deformed mutant sons. It's now time to kill a teen. They broke in on a dare. You are deformed. That's not your fault. We are mutant inbred scum. Abduct a girl. Howl a little. If you want, you two can marry. Obey me. I am old, but I'm your daddy. You scream and carry on. And I know that it's not easy to be calm when you found teenagers in your safe space. Take your time and kill them slow. Maybe gnaw their flesh a little, for you will still be here tomorrow, but these teens will not. How can I try to explain? When I do, they run away again. It's always been the same story. Since I was born, I can't talk. I'm kept chained up in the basement. I don't want to kill anyone, but I don't know my own strength. Daddy keeps you on a chain because look, you're killing teens again. You've got the mind of a child in the body of a man. You're too strong, that's not your fault. And your skull, it's just misshapen. Settle down in your straw and stop making all that noise. All the times that I've cried, keeping all the things I feel inside. Don't they know I'm more scared of them than they're scared of me? I have broken my own chains and packed up my stuffed animals. I'd rather be in something PG like the Goonies. And I know I have to go away. And I know I have to go. or deformed, blaming other people for their problems, or just overly competitive. People have been killing people for thousands of years. But tonight, we're going to shift gears because we're not just talking about your average everyday murder slobs. We are talking celebrity serial killers. So let's hop in the Wayback Machine to talk about murder's first big brand, Jack the Ripper. The Ripper killed 5 women between August and November of 1888, but he wasn't England's first serial killer. That was Mary Ann Cotton. He wasn't even the first Victorian serial killer to murder prostitutes in London. That was Dr. Thomas Crean. He wasn't even the first tourist destination serial killer. That was the Ratcliffe Highway murders, an unsolved home invasion that saw 7 people killed. The killer get away scot-free, and tourists would swarm through the house to look at the brain matter splattered on the ceiling. But Jack the Ripper set our modern day murder template. Newspaper advertisers paid for premium prices for placement on pages where their ads would be next to illustrations of the Ripper's victims, who were always depicted nude, dead, and with unrealistically perky breasts that were on full display for the sake of journalistic integrity. Jack the Ripper had a great name because he named himself. And even better, no one knew who he was. Newspapers claimed he was a Russian anarchist, a policeman, a Native American, a sailor, and a cowboy, which basically meant he was the 19th century village people. There were theories that he was a mad doctor, a religious fanatic, an upper-class erotic maniac, a sociologist seeking to wake up London and the plight of its poor by killing them, a woman, a corrupt cop, and Jews. All Jews, in fact. Every single Jew. But even Queen Victoria wrote Scotland Yard her own private psychological profile of the Ripper, telling them he's probably a sailor. The first modern day murder book appeared in October 1888 between Ripper Murders 4 and 5, when John Francis Brewer wrote the first Jack the Ripper fan fiction, A Curse Upon Mitre Square, in which he claimed that the Ripper was the ghost of a 16th century monk who'd killed his sister in a church and haunted Whitechapel to this day as the incarnation of pure evil. Reviewers called the book thrilling and condensed as a meat lozenge. I don't know what that means. In 1889, a man known only as Rhodesi wrote Lord Jacqueline Berkney, The Whitechapel Terror, in which a man named, not surprisingly, Lord Jacqueline Berkney discovered that he had a split personality that was the Whitechapel Terror. There was The Whitechapel Murders, or An American Detective in London, in which a Pinkerton detective travels to London to solve the Ripper killings. Then Jack the Ripper in New York, in which the Ripper goes to New York to commit more killings. There were fictional first-person Jack the Ripper diaries published in Scandinavia, Flemish Jack the Ripper plays, and even Wie Jack der Aufschlitzer Gestes wird, in which Sherlock Holmes captures the Ripper in a German novel. In 1911, Ripper fan fiction went respectable when Marie Belloc Lowndes' short Ripper novel, The Lodger, was published in McClure's magazine. Gertrude Stein and Ernest Hemingway were big fans, and Alfred Hitchcock turned it into a hit silent movie in 1926. Hitchcock would later adapt it into a radio play in 1940, and for years he wanted to do a color remake of The Lodger, but ultimately had to settle for making other movies about different men who murdered women who were not Jack the Ripper, like Psycho and Frenzy. So how do we get from Jack the Ripper to now? How do we get from this to this? They're not all that different, frankly. It all comes down to a number, Z500-599. So, did you guys hear the story about the babysitter? So, my sister's best friend who was babysitting these kids on Halloween, and a guy escaped from a mental hospital and put on a Halloween mask and killed a bunch of people. And then the babysitter killed him, but they never found his body, so he's probably still out there. Yeah, but actually before that, my brother's girlfriend had a cousin who went to a sorority in Canada, what they call it university, and one Christmas, everyone had gone home, but some of the girls hadn't left the dorm yet, and they started getting these weird phone calls from a really crazy guy who killed a bunch of them, and the police traced the call and told the last girl not to go upstairs because the calls were coming from inside the house. Yeah, but actually before that, this woman I work with, her mom's best friend's daughter's guidance counselor's sister's niece was babysitting in California, and she started getting phone calls from this crazy guy, and the cops traced it and told her to get out of the house because the calls were coming from inside the house, and she ran to get the kids, and the killer came after her with a knife, and she brained him with the freezer door and ran outside, but the cops showed up and killed the guy. That last one is Foster's Release, a 14-minute student film made in 1971 at USC Film School by Terrence Winkless, a man who was most famous to that point for playing Bingo the Gorilla on the Banana Splits Adventure Hour. Foster's Release played at a single USC film festival where it was almost definitely watched by one of Winkless's classmates, John Carpenter, who went on to direct Halloween, and it also played one other film festival in Edinburgh. And then nothing. Or so you thought, but actually, Foster's Release got distributed all over America as a short film shown in high school home economic classes to, quote, initiate a discussion of babysitting responsibilities and crisis response. As the film's booking materials claimed, beyond the chilling entertainment value of the film, the girl's handling of the situation exemplifies decisive action in a threatening situation. Foster's Release might just be ground zero in the modern day slasher film, but it's not. The slasher actually goes back to a specific urban legend floating around since the 60s known as the babysitter and the man upstairs, in which a babysitter gets threatening phone calls, the police trace them, and they're coming from inside the house. Slasher movies drew on urban legends to create our faceless killers, tapping into sort of our American collective unconscious. And the babysitter and the man upstairs is one of three that shaped the genre. In Ernest Bauman's landmark type and motif index of the folk tales of England and North America, these urban legends are classified under serial numbers Z500 to 599, covering stories which are not ghost or witch stories, but which are told because of the effective horror they produce in the listener. The emphasis is on the grisly or strange rather than the supernatural. So one of those other three is even earlier than the babysitter and the man upstairs. It's called The Roommate. It's about two roommates at college after everyone's left for the holidays. One goes out, comes back, and actually, hold on. One goes out, the other stays home. In the middle of the night, the one who stays home wakes up and hears all this noise in the hall and scratching and gurgling at the door. So she locks the door, wakes up the next morning, goes in the hall, and her roommate's lying on the floor with their throat slit. There's another version of this where the roommate who goes out, comes back late at night. The room's dark. There's a note on the door saying, don't turn on the light. She doesn't turn on the light. She gets into bed. The next morning, she wakes up. Her roommate's dead in her bed. And on the bed, wall over the bed, written in the roommate's blood is, aren't you glad you didn't turn over the light? There have been 31 variations on this specific folktale collected since 1961, but there's one even more primal than that, and it involves Dear Abby. On Tuesday, November 8th, 1960, a letter appeared in the syndicated Dear Abby column in newspapers all over America that read, Dear Abby, if you're interested in teenagers, you will print this story. I don't know whether it's true or not, but it doesn't matter because it served its purpose for me. A fellow and his date pulled into their favorite lover's lane to listen to the radio and do a little necking. The music was interrupted by an announcer who said there was an escaped convict in the area who had served time for rape and robbery. He was described as having a hook instead of a right hand. The couple became frightened and drove away. When the boy took the girl home, he went around to open her door, and then he saw a hook in the car door handle that had been torn off the man's arm. I don't think I will ever park or make out as long as I live. I hope this does the same for the other kids. Signed, Jeanette. This is the story of the hook, which has been recorded by folklorists as early as 1951. The folklore archives at the University of California, Berkeley have 70 different versions of this tale. The hook has it all. Teenagers in the woods at some desolate spot trying to have sex, getting attacked by a random unknown unnamed killer with an unusual weapon, and from that drawing the conclusion they should never have sex again. Researchers in the 50s and 60s found versions of the hook in Maryland, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, Kansas, Arkansas, Texas, Oregon, Canada, Utah, New Mexico, but it's not that simple. The earliest outbreak recorded of hook stories sprang up in Los Angeles in 1947 and 1948 during a citywide panic over what was called the Red Light Bandit, in which an unidentified man terrorized the city with a series of robberies and sexual assaults on young couples parked in Lover's Lane, using a red spotlight mounted on his car to make them think he was a cop. The police eventually arrested Carol Chessman, and he was sentenced to death thanks to the creative application of an anti-kidnapping law, which was applied to him because he dragged one of his victims 22 feet from her car. Chessman was a publicity hound, and his case was covered all over America, and he maintained his innocence right up until the end, so maybe they didn't get the real killer. And he wrote and published 4 books while in prison, one of which got made into a movie in 1955, and all of which were bestsellers. Sociologists point to a huge surge in hook stories in 1960, the same year Chessman was very publicly and very controversially executed. So, these urban legends like the hook and the babysitter, or and the roommate and the babysitter and the man upstairs, became Foster's Release, which became Black Christmas, which became Halloween in 1978, which opened the floodgates for the golden age of the slasher from 78 to 84, in which over 150 slashers hit the screens in 6 years, with name, Halloween was the start, then Friday the 13th, then the Nail Gun Massacre, and the Microwave Massacre, and the Toolbox Murders, and the Icebox Murders. As the golden age ended, slashers kept on coming, and they began to embrace the fact that their audiences and main characters were usually teenagers, and they were appealing to a progressively younger and younger crowd, until finally, in the late 80s, we arrived here. Slasher YA and middle grade books, which were aimed at 12 and 13-year-old readers, with Jason and Michael murdering children. So, the next step after this infantilization of the slasher genre came as celebrity serial killers turned into superheroes with powers beyond the reach of normal people. Thomas Harris's Silence of the Lambs in 1988 gave us Hannibal Lecter, a smarty pants doctor with maroon eyes, 6 fingers, and basically ESP. He fit right in with Freddy Krueger, a superpowered scar-faced dead pedophile who killed people with a knife glove in their dreams at the height of the slasher boom. And they would inspire serial killers like Temple Galt in Patricia Cornwell's best-selling book series, a gay super hacker karate expert serial killer who loves uniforms, or Rex Miller's Chain Gun Bunkowski is 400-pound super serial killer in his Slob series, who can turn invisible by regulating his respiration and heart rate like a ninja, has a genius-level IQ, and is immune to poison ivy. With all these superhuman, super ninja serial killers running around, we needed superheroes to catch them. And Thomas Harris invented those too. In his 1981 Red Dragon, Harris introduces us to FBI profiler Will Graham, a dude so dedicated to catching serial killers that he gets all up inside their heads until he thinks like them, man. Graham kicked off a whole slew of mind hunters, and they're real. The FBI's behavioral science unit, established in 1971, was so good at making criminal profiles of suspects that they sent out almost 600 criminal profiles to police departments each year, and they resulted in 5 arrests, which was about a 2.7% success rate. Another study showed that profilers were only marginally, within 1 percentage point, better than people recruited off the street at predicting offenders' possible future behavior based on psychological profilers. But that didn't stop writers who needed Batman super profilers to fight their Joker super serial killers. Fictional profilers are dedicated men with strong convictions who come to small towns where evil has been done, men with the power of the law behind them, who examine the evidence and apply their training at the scene of the crime, identifying the guilty, finding clues where other people see nothing, hoping to stop these godless monsters before they strike again. You know who else did that in real life? Certainly not FBI profilers who spent most of their time in cubicles writing reports. Mostly, the parallel was witch hunters, men of faith and conviction and training who went to small towns armed only with their knowledge that let them see clues and evidence where other people saw nothing, who examined crime scenes to reassemble the identity of the perpetrators who lived unsuspecting among their neighbors, hoping to stop them before they struck again. These these profilers don't come any more dedicated than Dr. Dean Grant, star of Dead Man's Float. Medical examiner for the city of Chicago, he's a tall man with a reddish mustache and light in his blue-gray eyes. Tell me more. His experience with human frailties, human viciousness, had jaded him into an outwardly casual cynicism that was, in truth, deep-seated, running amok at times, to the point where he had few friends. Sounds haunted. In his professional life, he displayed calm, controlled, and yet passionate concern for the job at hand, often spilling over into a madman's deliberate obsession. Sounds passionate. When the local cops tell Dr. Dean Grant that the body of 12-year-old Laura Baines, found floating in the Indiana lake, is there because Laura, like a typical 7th grader, has drowned herself to commit suicide, which actually seems on brand for Indiana, Dr. Dean Grant proves to the police that no 12-year-old will fold their clothes so neatly and leave them stacked in a little pile by the side of the lake. Someone else was here. Minds blown by his logic, the cops back off, leaving Dr. Grant to crouch over the pile of Laura's neatly folded clothing, muttering, "Laura, little girl, you're my priority number 1. My priority number 1. Driven, obsessed, dedicated, Dr. Grant even cancels his anniversary plans with his wife, Jackie, who cries, "Jesus Christ, Dean, so what? Another floater. There's always another floater. Always has been, always will be," which seems a little harsh when faced with a dead 12-year-old. But Dr. Dean Grant isn't bothered. He will solve this floater crime with science. But how? There aren't any clues. Aha! As he puts it, anything's possible in forensic medicine. And that's because the author, Robert Walker, just makes it all up. First, Dr. Grant sprays the dirt around the clothes with seconal. Most of us think of seconal as a powerful sedative, but are we doctors? No. Dr. Dean Grant knows that seconal will glow in the dark wherever it touches blood. Later, he'll use infrared photography to detect footsteps in a puddle. Yes, a puddle. Then he'll employ a small nuclear reactor to create the killer's hair chart from a clipping of his hair, which apparently is more unique than fingerprints. Dr. Dean Grant can scrape condensed human breath off a plastic bag and put your breath on a microscope slide, then put the slide in the tracer where laser beams will bombard it and turn it into a liquid. Is that how breathing works? I don't know, but it lets him solve crimes. The same science he uses is the science that describes bourbon as a chemical, napalm as a poison gas. But Dr. Dean Grant just doesn't rely on science. He also has the almost superhuman ability to detect when people are lying, although his detector wasn't any more reliable and even less admissible as evidence than a polygraph, but it was faster and surer. So, not very reliable, not admissible as evidence, but fast and sure. Get those witches to the stake, stat. It turns out that little Lawrence is the victim of a conspiracy by a girl who's possessed by her failed Catholic priest dead brother. These sinister supernatural siblings are drowning people to cleanse them of their sins and send them to God. And they've been doing it for years in cities all over America, but police departments who are too dumb to have access to a man of science who whispers to clothes like Dr. Dean Grant had just thought they've been accidents all these years. In later adventures, Dr. Dean Grant encounters an obese deli butcher who faints at the sight of blood and communes with the astral spirit of King Solomon when he gets high by huffing the breath of his victims, who he's asphyxiating inside plastic bags. He also battles a maniac armed with a laser blowtorch who hates eyes and burns them out of people because he believes that's how his mother's soul enters their body. But no enemy tests Dr. Grant as deeply as the one he encounters when he goes to Orlando, Florida in Razor's Edge and falls in love. There's a serial killer at work in Orlando who's scalping his victims alive, and Dr. Dean Grant is invited to assist. There he meets Dr. Ben Hamill, police psychiatrist. When Dr. Grant meets him, the two men shake each other's hands like doctors should, firmly, each caught in the other's gaze. Then Dr. Grant keeps thinking over and over about how handsome Dr. Hamill is, remarking repeatedly that he looks just like Henry Fonda in My Darling Clementine. Super sexy. Dr. Hamill looks so much like Henry Fonda that Dr. Dean Grant cannot say no when he invites him to dinner. There, Dr. Hamill says, "Do you mind if I call you Dean?" And Dr. Grant blushes and stammers, "No." Then Dr. Hamill insists that he call him Ben. And after telling Dean that he knows the scalpings are the work of two serial killers working as a team, because if you look over serial killers, you'll notice that the worst ones tend to involve two or more serial killers, which is not true at all. But then they have a final party manly handshake, and Ben holds on for a really long time and gently caresses Dr. Dean's hand. Curse with the gay boner. Dr. Grant receives a lucky break when Carson, a tough lady cop, is attacked by the scalper but escapes. She confirms not just that the killer is two men working together, but one of them is a midget. That should narrow down the suspects because, as Dr. Grant notes, it simply was not likely that two separate man and dwarf murder teams could be at work in a city the size of Orlando. Using irresponsible leaps in logic and totally fabricated forensic nonsense, Dr. Dean Grant learns that this man and dwarf murder team, the dwarf part of it, is Van, a lizard-eating dwarf who was kept chained in the basement by his parents as a child where rats nibbled off one of his ears. He is also very hairy and has a double row of teeth like a shark, and, according to the book, dresses as, quote, a Dickensian street urchin. His entire body is covered in hair. More hair than men should grow in a lifetime, we're told. His ears grow hair, his forehead grows hair, his back and shoulders and buttocks grow hair. Ironically, the one part of his body that doesn't grow hair is his head. In order to please Satan, who loves hair and has promised to make him a dark wizard when he's totally hairy, Van and his partner are scalping people to turn them into a toupee that will fool Satan. That partner? Dr. Ben Hamill. Van is his brother, and Ben worships Van because Van has all this powerful body hair. See, Dr. Hamill has very little body hair, and so he eats big bowls of hair stew and rubs gels made from the fat of his victims onto his skin, hoping he'll absorb their powerful DNA and grow hair like his brother. But when Van starts going on about wanting to scalp babies, Dr. Hamill's like, I don't think that's a good idea. And Van's all, "You don't do the thinking around here, cue ball." And then he whips Dr. Hamill with a bullwhip made of braided human hair. Also, the two brothers are total nuts for the music of Bob Seger. It all ends in brother on brother scalping and Dean versus Dwarf wrestling matches, climaxing when the brothers are eaten by an alligator, which one of the Orlando policemen calls a fitting Florida end for that little man. And as we bring our time together this evening to a fitting Florida end, I want to talk to you finally about the Final Girl support group because it took me a long time to write this book. The first files dated January 9th, 2014, but I actually started working on this book 40 years ago in 1981. See, as a kid, I wasn't allowed to watch R-rated movies. I read the Marvel comic adaptations and would pretend I'd seen the movie, or I'd read the movie parodies in Mad Magazine and pretend I'd seen an R-rated movie. That's how I saw Jaws. That was tricky, though, because I would get things wrong and friends would call me out. So I came up with this idea. After Cub Scout meetings, we'd go across the street to the Oasis gas station and buy snacks. And I managed to convince my scoutmaster that I was allowed to buy magazines with my snack money because reading is good. The first magazine I picked up was Fangoria number 12, April 1981. And I read their feature on the opening scene of Friday the 13th, Part 2, and a door opened. I read it again and again. And if you don't remember the movie, Alice Hardy, played by Adrienne King, is the final girl from the first Friday. And now at the beginning of part two, she's chilling in her crummy apartment, having nightmares, wearing these weird plaid overalls, jumping at loud noises, arguing with her mom on the phone, when out of nowhere Jason appears and ice picks her in the head. My mind was blown. She went through all that savagery and bloodshed in part one, lost all her friends, had to decapitate Ms. Voorhees, and is trying to put her life back together, and they just kill her. The casual cruelty of that really hit me. You think it's just another Wednesday night in Albany, and you're in the sequel. There is no escape. There is no mercy. The killer always gets us in the end. We are not people, we are a body count. And I always thought that was so savage that I wanted to rewrite that moment and give this final girl a happier ending. So, cut to 40 years later, I've written the Final Girl support group. I get Adrienne King's address from my friend Ted, and I send her a copy. And she loves it, and she calls me up, and we get to talking, and I tell her about this issue of Fangoria and my obsession with the beginning of Friday the 13th Part 2, and she tells me this story. So when Adrienne made Friday the 13th Part 2, she was 21 years old. She'd had a fun time making the first one. The producers called her up about making a second. She said, that'd be great. I've got some personal issues. We may have to work around them, but it's no big deal. They say, sure. So she doesn't hear from her a while, and then eventually gets a call to come to set. So she shows up, assuming she's the star of the movie, and that this is the first day of production. And, she didn't get a script, but that was fine. She didn't have a script for the first one, really. They improvised a lot of it. And so she comes on thinking it's day one of production. It's the last day of production. They tell her, improvise a phone call with her mom, react to a few things in the apartment. Oh my gosh, there's something scary in your fridge. Give us a nice reaction shot. And Adrienne doesn't know that she's not the star of the movie. And in fact, doesn't know what's going to happen until that stuntman playing Jason stabs her in the side of the head with a collapsible ice pick. And you can see it in the movie. Friday the 13th movies are not shy about showing their kills, but there is one single shot of Adrienne getting the ice pick in the head. No gore effect, no shot of her dead body, one and done. Because when they did, they tipped their hand and one shot was all they got. The personal issues Adrienne was having at the time that she warned the producers about, they thought she was pregnant, she thinks. She actually had a stalker. The guy was nameless. He was faceless. He followed her everywhere and took pictures of her in public. He took pictures of her in public bathrooms on the toilet. He took pictures of her with her friends out having coffee, and then he would leave them on her apartment doorstep. He was everywhere. He was nowhere. He told her no one would ever believe her if she reported him. It got so bad that she had to put a deadbolt on the inside of her bathroom door to feel safe enough to take a shower. When the nameless, faceless stuntman playing Jason sunk that fake ice pick into the side of Adrienne's head, she didn't know what was going on. But suddenly the shoot wrapped, and they put her in a car, dropped her off back at the motel, and left her there, totally isolated, completely cut off, and all alone. I wrote the Final Girl support group in part because I wanted to write a happier ending for this final girl I'd seen in a magazine 40 years ago, But I also wrote it because I was starting to wonder what was wrong with me. I love horror movies and I've been watching them for most of my life. And that means I've spent 40 years watching people get murdered for fun. And I was starting to think, what does that mean? People think of slasher movies as these camp artifacts from the 80s, little nostalgia nuggets, but they are the real life, modern day template for the all Americans horror story. A heavily armed man walks through a supposedly safe place, a school, a workplace, a college, and he methodically kills every single person he finds. Get a little more existential, and maybe you're some guy who read about a horror movie in a magazine 40 years ago, and now you're writing the end of this book in August of 2020 during the second wave of the pandemic, huddled behind locked doors and windows, suspicious of any stranger because they might wind up making you dead. Totally isolated, completely cut off, and all alone. And outside my locked doors, there's a faceless killer stalking all the places we used to go: summer camps, gyms, supermarkets. All the things we did for fun are over: prom, sports, vacations, they're gone. Hospitals are the last place you want to wind up. They're not where you get healthy, they're where you get dead. College dorms and campuses lie empty. To go to the supermarket takes military strategic planning. To leave your house and go on the empty streets is terrifying. The only thing outside our bedrooms and apartments is something that wants us dead. And I realized as I wrote the end of this book that while I love a nihilistic ending as much as the next maladjusted weirdo, the horror movies I love, the ones I come back to over and over again, they were the ones that had final girls in them. The ones where these women come in, burst through the doors with their big sister energy, and grab our hands and say, run. And so we run through the dark woods, all of us, filling the space between the trees, running at full speed, tripping, falling down, getting up over and over again. And we can't stop. We can't turn around because the killer is right behind us with a machete or a butcher's knife or a chainsaw or a pizza cutter or a camera tripod or an icicle or a coronavirus. And the woods are full of us and we're all running. And now imagine we're in a movie and this is a shot in that movie and we pull back and we get a wider angle and we see the killers right on our heels. The Jasons and the Freddys and the Michaels and the Normans and the Ted Bundys and the Ed Geins and that guy from the bar who won't take no for an answer and that stalker and that drunk driver and that building inspector. And we pull back further and we see behind them are their monsters chasing them, their abusive fathers, their schoolyard bullies, their poverty, their dead too soon parents, their closed skull injuries, their alcoholic grandparents. And back further and we see their monsters right on their heels and their monsters back and back and back all the way until we see the one monster coming for us all in his hooded robe carrying a scythe. And up ahead of us, the trees are thinning, and we're coming to the edge of the woods, and we can see the sky, and it's getting lighter, and we realize we made it. We're going to survive. And behind us are all the ones we left behind, our dead friends, the ones we lost, our grandparents, that girl from work you talked to a few times, our great aunts, all those hundreds of thousands of people who died in nursing homes, who died in ICUs, who died alone, but we survived. We did it. And any second, the credits are going to roll, and we made it. We made it one more day. And we didn't have to be strong. We didn't have to be smart. We didn't have to have a master plan or a handgun with good stopping power or a full body suit with a face mask or a finely honed sense of danger. All we had to do was just not stop. That's how you don't get murdered. Because every day is a horror movie. And the next day is always waiting for us because one thing we've learned is there's always a sequel. But all we have to do is keep running. All we have to do is get up when we fall down. All we have to do is not quit. And so we survive. We survived the original and the sequel and the threequel and all the spin-offs. My Dumb Fucking Life, part 14,603, the final chapter, part 2. Adrian didn't die in that motel room where they dropped her off after she got ice picked in Friday the 13th, part 2. She didn't give up. Her stalker didn't get her. She kept going. She left New York. She headed out west. She did some stunts in Ghostbusters, and she started a career doing dialogue looping and voiceover recording. If you've seen Titanic or Jerry Maguire or Philadelphia or Mouse Hunt, you've heard Adrian's voice on the soundtrack, a final girl hidden in the audio. She's retired and runs a winery now. And 40 years after a kid in a Cub Scout uniform stood in an Oasis gas station, wishing he could write a different ending for this 21-year-old woman he'd never met, we met. And Adrian wound up narrating the Final Girl Support Group audiobook and crushing it. We don't watch horror movies to see people die. We watch them to see people survive. Let's roll the closing credits. It's time to say goodbye. And please, I want you to remember, we are all going to die and 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 die. Every single one of us will die and die and die. It's the thing we have in common, the thing we can't outrun. Dying in a car wreck or getting too much sun. Use sunscreen, attacked by wolverines, attacked by machetes, or attacked by wolverines. Maybe it's a power drill or COVID-19. Every college dorm is bloody, every summer camp is cursed, every frat house is a slay ground, and sororities are worse. Maybe it's by heart attack, maybe by harpoon, but death is out there waiting for everybody on this Zoom. And die and die and die and die and die and die and die. Every single one of us will die and die and die. So let's roll down all the windows. Let's turn off all the alarms. Let's drive into the countryside and enter haunted barns. Let's investigate strange noises like a bunch of stupid jerks. Let's plan a long camping trip to where our phones don't work. And die and die and die and die and die and die and die. Every single one of us will die and die and die. There are many different ways to die, some better and some worse. But every sentient being will die across the universe. Suns will die and stars will die, babies, puppies too. Whales and snails and great big pails of interstellar goo. Dummies, mummies, fluffy bunnies, those with high IQs. Pretty ponies, guys named Tonys, and girls named Celia too. Kings and queens and in-betweens, and one day, so will you. You'll die and die and die and die and die and die and die. Every single one of you will die and die and die. So thanks for coming out to see me. But it's time to say farewell. We may never meet again. So I'll see you all in hell and die and die and die and die and die and die and die. Every person on this Zoom will die and die and die. Thank you for joining me tonight. Have a good evening and try not to die quite yet.